As promised, for more on the political fallout here in the U.S., let's turn to our own political analyst, Richard Wolffe, the author of Renegade, The Making of a President. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
All right. The president again today stressed that the U.S. is not meddling, but his State Department got Twitter to delay maintenance on its server until most of Iran would be asleep. Would this be quiet meddling?
Well, they neither want to be entirely quiet, and they obviously don't want to be seen to be meddling, but they are actually intervening in one way or another beyond the sort of marginal stuff about Twitter. And these new technology, as Richard Engel rightly pointed out, have been incredibly important to the reform movement. But beyond that, the most important weapon, tool, if you will, that the president has is what he says. And here the White House is treading this incredibly difficult and fine line between making a statement of moral authority about obviously being pro-democracy and wanting to encourage the people who support the reform movements, and yet on the other hand not wanting to taint the reformists by suggesting or playing into the reactionary crowd's hands of looking like the reformers are a tool of American power. So this is incredibly difficult, but the real meddling, the stuff that isn't so quiet, is what comes out of the president's mouth. That's where the White House has been focusing its attention.
All right, to that point, and then a little bit more later about the question of what we might be doing to facilitate communications there. The caution today from the president that there is not that much of a difference from a U.S. foreign policy perspective between Mousavi and Ahmadinejad. What was that about?
Well, that's really about the supreme leader. In the end, the national security analysis here is that the nuclear program, because that's really what we're talking about, as well as obviously support for terrorist groups, but especially the nuclear program, is in the hands of the supreme leader. And whoever the elected president is, that nuclear program will proceed along its own track. So, yes, there are real differences between the reform movement and the forces behind Ahmadinejad. Mm-hmm. But in terms of what America really wants out of this, of course, greater trade, greater openness in Iran is important, but first and foremost, the nuclear program, they don't ultimately think the calculation is going to change either way.
Senator McCain suggested this morning that the Iranian people, as he put it, should not be subjected to 4 more years of Ahmadinejad. Has there been any, first off, what is the political split on this? Is there really a sizable reaction, even in the Republican Party, that we should somehow be doing more about Iran? And has anybody suggested what it is we could do about Iran without looking like we were deliberately pushing it one way or the other?
Well, the tough talk feels good, and the Republicans have been engaging it for many years, but there was this thing called the Bush administration, and there was this thing called the axis of evil. They tried it. What was the end result? Iran has thousands of centrifuges enriching uranium, and North Korea, another part of the axis of evil, now has 8 to 12 nuclear weapons. So, you know, they tried that path, and it's great going on TV talking like that, but what's the end result? If you really care about the end result in Iran, that approach has not left many options either for people in the region or for the policymakers in Washington.
All right, you just heard Richard Engel say, using his own expertise, he has no idea how this is going to turn out. I'm not going to ask you to offer a prediction. I would presume it would be rather similar. But what is going forward? What is this country's role going to be in how it turns out? Are we simply, essentially, an IT department to make sure that the communications stay open from people inside that country?
You know, in any country, some of the most corrosive factors can be American or any outside government trying to interfere with an election. In the end, the election is a means to an end. What matters is building closer relationships with the Iranian people, better trade, and getting world opinion to counter this nuclear program. Yes, it would be nice to have a favorable president in place, but those policies have to go on anyway.
Richard Wolffe of MSNBC, author of the new book, Renegade. As always, great thanks, Richard. Have a good night.
Thank you, Keith.
Our fourth story on the countdown, the Obama administration has refused to release a simple list of names of visitors to the White House, even though a federal judge has twice ruled that visitor logs must be released, which makes President Obama on this point perfectly consistent with President Bush. So-called transparency be damned. This time, MSNBC.com made the request for the names of all White House visitors from January 20th to the present. The Secret Service denied the request, just as it denied a request from the watchdog group Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, also known as CREW. That inquiry was for visits by executives of coal companies to the Obama White House. CREW has filed a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees the Secret Service, but a nearly identical case has already been decided twice, with a ruling against the administration's position. the Bush administration. In October 2006, Crew sought records of visits by 9 religious leaders to the Bush White House. Request denied. Crew filed suit, and in December 2007, U.S. District Judge Royce Lamberth, appointed to the bench by Ronald Reagan, rejected the argument of the Bush White House. Judge Lamberth said that a list of names of White House visitors is not protected by presidential privilege. But the Department of Homeland Security refused to release the visitor logs, and it made a similar argument about presidential communication. Yet Judge Lamberth ruled against Homeland Security on January 9th of this year. The Bush administration, 1 week from expiring, appealed that decision, and the Obama administration agreed, making it only the second administration to argue in court that visitors' logs to the People's House, the White House, should remain private. Let's bring in the Washington editor of The Nation magazine, Chris Hayes. Chris, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
The Obama White House does not want the public to know who visits the Obama White House or also the Bush White House. Are we left to assign the kind of the most crass political motive to that?
I don't even know what motive there is other than this basic, raw institutional prerogative of, protecting oneself and accruing the maximal amount of power and latitude. I mean, this is something you see, and as a community organizer, I'm sure Barack Obama was on the other side of it. When you go up against a university or a organized religion or a hospital, a local governor, that power tends to consolidate. It tends to want to defend itself, and that's a really insidious tendency, and that's, I think, what we're seeing here. Are
they viewing it the way that people view silly copyright infringements when you hear about some major multinational corporation suing somebody for $15 for making a logo that looks like theirs, that there's really no point but to exercise the authority in fear that somehow you're going to lose it if you don't use it?
Well, I think one question is the lag time on the transmission of policy. So the only real charitable explanation here is that these kinds of filings are overseen by essentially civil servants. I mean, ultimately it's political appointees, but that the new boss in town and the new agenda hasn't yet filtered down to that level. That's the charitable interpretation. I think the uncharitable interpretation is that whatever the symbolism, they don't want people to know who's coming to visit them in the White House.
Chris, there's another instance of action trumping a promise of transparency, at least thus far. The Justice Department in this administration last week defended the Defense of Marriage Act, which basically denies even to legally married same-sex couples thousands of different benefits that straight couples take for granted. As a candidate, Obama had pledged to repeal the entire act. How is the administration explaining this one on an overall basis? This is not some bureaucrat filling out leftover paperwork from the Bush administration.
No, and the explanations so far have been pretty insufficient. They're not saying a ton publicly on this. I think they've talked about re-examining the legal rationale, but I do know that there are reports that are out there, and I think if you look at the kind of uprising that's been building among the LGBT community, you have this big news today about several very prominent gay donors pulling out of a fundraiser. Mm-hmm. There's been a letter from the head of the Human Rights Campaign expressing his frustration, even despair, disgust at the language of that particular brief. You have the New York Times editorial page. There is a brewing sort of insurgency and revolt among some core progressive constituencies, particularly in the LGBT community. That's going to be a real political problem for the White House.
And, of course, there's Bill Maher, who was on here last night on his own show last Friday, my old Cornell friend here, who has only half-jokingly claimed that there's now evidence of a trend, that on certain issues the administration is playing it way too safe, that the pledge of real change has really changed.
Yeah, this is the big $64,000 central existential question at the heart of this administration, which is the disposition towards consensus and incrementalism, is that salutary, or is that ultimately not going to be enough to meet the challenges of the moment? I continue to hope that they're headed in the right direction, but there's real concern, and I think it's legitimate.
There is a honeymoon. It has an ending date. We're not sure when that is. Chris Hayes of The Nation, many thanks as always. Talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot, Keith.